Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And with me, as always, is my co-host, Derek Cohen. He's our Chief of Research and Policy. Did I get that right?
The Chief of Research and Policy, did you spell that out?
Yeah. Chief of Policy and Research, that we don't have the bad acronym. Well, season 4, here we go. New year. All right, first episode of the year. So they haven't canceled us upstairs, so that's good. It helps that we're part of the executive committee that would make that decision. But anyway, so we're on to season 4, and this is the interim, of course. This is the interim year here in Texas. There's no legislative session, and so this is our busy season, right? Mm-hmm. This is when we do the research and we figure out what's going on in Texas and what we need to, the policies that we need to be promoting and all of that kind of stuff. And TPPF will be announcing its official agenda here pretty soon. So that's a big project of yours.
Yeah. Oh, well, communicating is a project of yours.
Well, that's true. Yeah, your work is done, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I just want to tell everyone, I'm like, I've done my part. I could go talk to Brian. I don't know when it's coming out.
All right. Well, hot take. It is. It's January, and so I was just noticing it's officially Hollywood award season. Which is sort of an embarrassment of riches for those of us who like to laugh at Hollywood and the left. So I'm asking you, Derek, the hot take question is: do you avoid all of that stuff? On Sunday night, it's like every Sunday they have like a new award show. They just had the Golden Globes. Do you avoid all that stuff, or do you watch the train wreck?
Oh, no, I assiduously avoid it. I mean, obviously, not the fact that we're still in the football season makes it, very easy to avoid. But, I really don't have, I don't know if this is the most canned conservative response ever. I just don't have time for, like, the pun intended, cause celebs that they trot out there, and, the virtue signaling is part of it. And not only that, but if you look at, like, what is being honored, there is that pool's draining, too, because you have so much fewer quality new intellectual properties out in Hollywood these days, and that it's just everyone's doing the safe thing. It's Marvel, making the same movie 26 times, then changing the cinematic universe and then making 26 more. Yeah. That's not to say I don't enjoy the Marvel movies. They can actually be quite enjoyable. But the thing is, it's like a cookie cutter process.
But none of those movies are even at the awards. I mean, that's one thing we used to do. Is my wife and I used to the next day we'd find out what won or whatever, and then we'd say, okay, we're going to go put that on our Netflix list. But but those movies, the ones that people seem to like, aren't even the ones that get nominated for the awards.
It's a thing. We're going to rail against the elite intelligentsia, but it's basically stuff that they do for themselves.
Right? Yeah.
The fact that people even were talking about One Battle After Another, which if you saw it was just objectively horrible.
Well, I guess that's on my list.
Yeah. Well, it illustrates that.
The part I like is the reason why I think some people do watch it and talk about it the next day is because it's sort of that old adage of keep your mouth shut and have people think you're a fool, or open it and remove all doubt. And that's kind of what happens during these like acceptance speeches, that they start to talk about politics, and it's like, for those of us who are like steeped in the middle of it, you're like, that is not the issue. What is going on?
And not something that I want to be doing on a Sunday night.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get to the fun part. Our fun part of this is why we're all here. We're a huge issue right now. It's probably, depending on, I guess, the day of the week. But the biggest issue I think in the country right now is what's going on in Minnesota and what that really means and what they're finding out there in terms of the government fraud that's happening up there. Of course, the ICE situation is just as bad. But we want to dive into the government fraud issue. Government fraud is not a victimless crime. Every dollar lost to fraud is a dollar that doesn't go to a classroom, to a road repair, or public safety. And yet, year after year, we see massive fraud schemes exposed only after the money is long gone. Recent cases in Minnesota have reignited a familiar question. How does this keep happening? Those weren't small accounting errors. They were large, organized schemes and exploited weak oversight and opaque systems and a lack of real-time accountability. And they weren't unique. Similar stories have played out at the federal level and across states, especially as governments rush billions of dollars out the door for emergencies. The standard response is more audits, more reports, and more investigations after the fact. But by then, the damage is done, the fraudsters are gone, the money is gone, and taxpayers are left holding the bill. That raises a deeper issue. If transparency is such a powerful tool, why does it vary so widely from one state to another, or even from one federal agency to another? Today, we're asking a more fundamental question. How do you actually stop fraud before it starts? What systems, incentives, and transparency standards would prevent bad actors from ever accessing public funds in the first place? Who is doing this well? Who is doing this poorly? And what reforms would make it harder, not easier, to commit? To help us unpack that is an old friend. I'm joined by an expert who has spent years studying government fraud, oversight failures, and the reforms that actually work. John Hart is CEO of Open the Books. John, thanks for being here.
You bet. It's a pleasure to be here.
John has decades of experience advocating for government transparency, having worked alongside the late Senator Tom Coburn on the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act of 2006, which laid out the foundation for online public spending databases, which we are deep into. Yeah. So thank you for all that. Right. He is now leading Open the Books in the fight to bring full real-time transparency to government spending. Okay, so John, let's just talk about like the anatomy of fraud. You guys did a deep dive on the Minnesota case, so you can jump into that a little bit if you want to. But how does it start?
Yeah, Brian, that's such a great, and your opening was really fantastic. So the key question for people is to ask, is this a bug or is it a feature in the system? In other words, is this an anomaly? Oh, I can't believe this happened in Minnesota. Surely that's an isolated case. Or is it more systemic? And I think the answer, sadly, and we've seen over and over again, is that this is more systemic. Well, how did we get to this point? And to really answer that question, I want to talk about the Minnesota case in particular, but we need to back up and have a worldview discussion of why are we in this position we're in? Well, it's because about 100 years ago, there was a very intentional movement. The progressive movement decided that the founders got this limited government thing wrong. We need to actually have a stronger centralized government. We need to empower these administrative agencies with more authority over our daily lives. Mm-hmm. So as we look at what happened in Minnesota, we're looking at the flow of money through different federal agencies. And the more that money moves around, the easier it is for fraudsters to take advantage of the system. And in your opening, you made a very important point, is that the transparency laws and standards vary so much state to state. Mm-hmm. So back when we worked on FFATA, the Federal Funding, Accountability, Transparency Act, Coburn-Obama, which we did shortly before you came on the Hill, I think, 2006.
So that was a Coburn-Obama bill?
It was a Coburn-Obama. Wow. Yeah, I'll tell you, the background story is really interesting for this because Coburn came in 2000. I worked with him in the House, actually, 97 to 2000. And then he was a self-term limited member. Imagine that. He actually kept his term limits pledge. So when Coburn got to the Senate, I was with him the second half of his House tenure. When he got to the Senate, he already had his team assembled, and we had experience. One of the truisms in life is that adversity drives innovation. Mm-hmm. Now, when you're a backbencher in the House, I don't know if you ever worked in the House side.
I did, but Mexico.
Yeah, you have to be very creative and very aggressive and relentless to get any attention to your issues because you're just one of 435. Yep. And then you get to the Senate, all of a sudden you have the rules.
That's right. Okay? You're one of 100.
You have the procedure. You're one of 100. Yeah. And having Mike Lee, that was such a breath of fresh air. It's like finally some reinforcements and Jim DeMint, Rubio back in that day. Yeah. So when he got to this, one of the things we wanted to focus on is this issue of transparency, because we would ask the Appropriations Committee staff, hey, can you send us the bill? So our boss, he actually liked to read the bill. Imagine that before he voted on it. So rather than send us the searchable document, okay, like an Excel spreadsheet, you can just keyword search it, right? They would take that and turn it into an unsearchable PDF. Intentionally, just to throw up a roadblock. So that just incensed Coburn. Yeah. So that really motivated him to think about, well, how do we make it hard to hide the ball? How do we make it hard for the other team? And we say the other team is that history is a forever war between freedom and authoritarianism. That's why the founders wrote the Constitution like they did. Is because they wanted to limit concentrations and consolidations of power and to invest power in we the people. That's how our system's supposed to work. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, he worked with this other ambitious senator from Illinois who wanted to have a bipartisan accomplishment. And actually, our first option with this particular senator was to reform healthcare. And he rejected that, sadly. Wow. And so history would have taken a very different turn had Obama moderated his healthcare agenda, but he didn't. And we got Obamacare and the fight that you're very familiar with. So then transparency was like
Senator Coburn for not being more convincing.
Had he been more persuasive. So we got transparency. We put all federal spending online, okay? And the ambition wasn't just to create a law. It was to create a norm and an expectation that anywhere at any level, government should publish and make spending searchable. Okay. Now, that's succeeded magnificently in many respects. The fact that We downsized. We kind of reimagined foreign aid, right, with USAID. We looked at PBS funding. All of those were subject to years of transparency work. That's part of why those cuts were successful. But it's very selective. It's very inconsistent. And so the new standard that should be the standard at the federal and every local and every level of government is real-time transparency. Every dime online, real time. That's our tagline and our mission at Open the Books. And I'm convinced if the founders wrote the Constitution today, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, they would have written into that real-time transparency. That should be the standard because we have the technology to do that, and and that would solve a lot of what we saw in Minnesota. And
how feasible? I mean, when I go to the store and I use my, credit card, I literally get a notice as I'm walking out the door that I just spent money at the grocery store.
Right.
So, this is kind of a little tongue in cheek, devil's advocate, but they would say, well, how feasible is that? When government, when a school district decides to spend a bunch of money on a field trip or something like that, how soon do those receipts get into the system? And when you say real time, do you mean the next day or what are we talking about?
I mean like more or less immediately, unless there's a national security issue or a personal privacy issue.
Okay.
Actually the technology is not that hard. That should be the standard. And that's so we're working with other groups like Cicero, and we'd love for you guys to work on that. So and there's a bill, actually Chip Roy, when Elon and DOGE got access to the Treasury payment system. Okay, I describe the Treasury payment system as like the administrative state's holy of holies. Only the high priest of progressive governments can enter that. When really, we should have the same right to view those payments as we do our own checkbook because it's our money. And to your point, it's like wherever you bank, Truist or Chase, whatever, you can go online at any point and see in real time what's happening. There's no reason why a taxpayer shouldn't be able to do that at every level of government. And it's only our imagination that is stalling that.
Well, let me ask you about that. So I think the holy of holy reference actually I think is very, very fitting. What is the counter argument? What would obviously, if you're trying to convince us on transparency, you're pushing on an open door.
Yeah.
But what is the counter argument? What does the other side say that, just the sheer volume of transaction from that particular system so high, or that, we're going to be giving out trade secret, or what's the pushback?
Yeah, well, the pushback is a couple things. One is there's both the stated pushback and the unstated pushback, right? The stated one would be the national security issue. That's a real issue. You don't want to have a disbursement to a CIA agent overseas, with their address. That's stupid. Of course, there should be safeguards on or national security, but even that is abuse. Like that's a whole other separate question of the overclassification of everything. And then, personal information, that would be a pushback. But the other pushback we get, which is both sincere and I think and opportunistic, is, well, it's just too hard to get all these databases to coordinate. It's spread, the money's spread over so many agencies. You'll never get them to work together. But those are exactly the arguments that were levied against us when we did USA spending back to over 20 years ago. But they figured it out. It's not that hard.
Yeah, we have the issue here in Texas when we do PIA requests, Public Information Act requests. People make up all these crazy reasons about proprietary information. Like one of the proprietary pieces of information we get is how much the project costs, and it's like, well, how is that possibly? Like that's the most important part. Is like, what are we spending?
Right, it's your money that is going to that project.
Right,
you have every right to know that.
So go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say yes and that by saying, and don't forget the old tried and true tactic of getting your lawyer to give it a look at it, and then they're claiming attorney-client privilege.
Right, we're fighting that right now. Is that you pass it through the lawyer, and then the lawyer gives it to the counsel, and it's like, oh well, we were talking to the lawyer on that, so that's now
secret work product.
Yeah. So the question is, so is the issue then? This is my intro was, look, we have transparency. My issue is there not enough transparency or real-time transparency so people can catch this stuff before it becomes a $9 billion scandal.
Right. There is not enough, and it's not fast enough. It's not. It's way too inconsistent. There are too many opportunities for fraudsters to hide the money. So people ask, well, how do you define wasted fraud? Well, fraud is spending where there's a constituency of one, the fraudster, the person that benefits from it. Waste is a violation of the social contract, where you give the government $1 of your freedom in exchange for more than $1 back. And of course, we know that the way government works is the dollars we give to the government taxes often doesn't come back with the higher multiplier
Lucky
effect.
if you get a nickel.
But yeah, so that's it's important to kind of have that terminology straight. Yes, transparency really does. So I describe, transparency. My metaphor is that transparency cuts through government like water cuts through stone. Okay, the flow can seem unremarkable and mundane, but over time, when it finds cracks, it can wipe away mighty walls of opposition. So if you're a homeowner, you've ever managed a property with any water issues, like how powerful water is. And if you've seen the way canyons, water is an extremely powerful, and transparency operates the same way. And we just saw that happen. Mike Benz was on Joe Rogan, and he did a lot of oversight on foreign aid. And what Mike told Joe Rogan is, look, what separates the United States from communist China is USA spending, is that we can go look at this stuff and find it. And we just need a lot more transparency at every level of government. And so that's if you really want to understand what will change and move the needle, it's transparency. And it's engaging the public in a worldview conversation. You don't want to frame that's too intellectual to say it's a world, but really it's going back to first principles. Is why do we have the Constitution? Why do we have limited government? And this idea that every dollar saved in Washington or Austin is a dream realized somewhere else.
Right.
And it's that opportunity cost between what we give government and what we get in return.
And we're conservatives, so we believe in federalism. But at the same time, if there's no national standard, even within the federal government, there's no standard from agency to agency. So number one, can we do something about that?
Yeah.
And then number two, what kind of leverage would the federal government have to impose some kind of transparency standard on state books?
Sure.
Probably not a lot, right?
Well, I think this is one of these examples where the law can be a teacher, right? The law can help create norms if you have good laws. So I started to mention Chip Roy, actually, when Elon got access to the Treasury payment system. I did an op-ed, did kind of a letter to DOGE, and Chip and I were talking. He really got the issue and understood it. So he introduced a bill that would at least give Congress access to the Treasury payment system. You would think that's a no-brainer separation of powers issue. And so that bill sidestepped some of these other national security issues, but there's since been a new version drafted with Chip is leaving, as you know full well. But Chip is working with us and other members of the House Budget Committee on a new version. Josh Brasheen is a good friend. He's working with me on this. Congress. He was a field rep for Coburn. So Josh is a wonderful member.
Long time. But what about state to state? If I know Ohio and Josh Mandel were doing some good things there when he was Secretary of Treasury or whatever, Department of Treasury. But state to state, it just depends. Is it just the willpower of the state to actually become more transparent?
Yeah, it is. Right. Obviously, it varies a lot based on the politics of the state. So what happened there were a couple things in Minnesota that were particularly bad. Okay, so one thing Minnesota did that was just colossally dumb is they got rid of their treasurer. Okay,
I thought you were going to say elect Tim Wall.
Well, that was we're not. I'll let you make that comment. So. I'm on the board of a group called the State Financial Officers Foundation. So, and I'll give OJ Oleka, who's the new CEO, did a great op-ed in the Wall Street Journal describing how Minnesota was a penny wise, a pound foolish, because they got rid of the treasurer's office. It made it harder to track spending within the state. So that gets to the issue we just talked about, which is the transparency issue. So that was one particular problem. But then the other thing that's really important to drill down on, if I would just highlight one dumb thing the federal government did, is that Biden actually created a rule that allowed states to base payments on enrollment. So we have a whole Substack written on this that people can read. So when you base openthebooks.com, yeah. So when you base payment based on enrollment and not attendance, that is a magnet for fraud. That was just colossally foolish to do it that way. So the Trump administration is addressing that and fixing it. But there's huge, and we publish this, but there's huge variation, obviously, in how the states give out the money, how much money they get. Texas is the biggest recipient of the funding in this category, $11 billion, because it's the biggest state. But Texas does more of a voucher type system. But what we're trying to do is crowdsource oversight. So we have an internal investigative team. We do great research, great work product. But there's so much of this to uncover, and the Nick Shirley example is a beautiful example of citizen journalism and activism. But all of our organizations can be part of that solution of just elevating the issue, making the data available, and encouraging and empowering people to take initiative to find the waste and be citizen journalists.
Thanks for bringing it back to Texas.
That's right. Yeah.
Derek, I mean, this is part of what we do here is we search these databases. And do you feel like Texas has enough transparency? I mean, we obviously get pushed back and we end up in court and we're fighting, to get things not redacted and all that. So we still have some issues here. But as Texas goes, do you feel like you can maneuver and get around, or do you think there's a lot more work that needs to be done?
When engaging with good faith actors, I think we probably are at least a little bit better positioned than other states are. Specifically, you have to look at where all the, well, again, to use the correct delineation, where the waste happens, not necessarily the fraud happens. It all happens in broad daylight. You needn't look further than the whole Austin City Council scandal of 2025, remember those days.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the problem is that the reason that everyone was able to find out that they were spending, $10,000 for political donations, while they were spending, all sorts of, personal office discretionary funds for things that did not benefit, not even a subset of taxpayers, but benefited the council member themselves, is because that was public. Yeah, Austin does a really good job of publishing, actually having the I don't know, the lag's probably a little more, but they do have what is essentially an online checkbook. Unfortunately, they also had no shame in the fact of what they were doing, and so nobody they didn't bother. Yeah, they didn't bother hiding. And I think that you saw, though, that became a incredibly potent political issue towards the end of 2025, to the point where Kurt Watson's out there now saying that we're going to have an independent audit. Now, devil's in the details on that, but still, the fact that we actually have a city administration that is calling for not only transparency, but independently verified transparency, that's something I never thought we'd see.
Yeah, and John, I want to get to this, the audits. Like, this is a big problem we have, is like, we have some laws in the books that say you have to audit, but the audit just says, did the money go out? That's like literally the only question. That doesn't tell you.
That's not it.
Was it the right amount? Any of that. And then what we're pushing for, of course, is performance audits, which is, did the money go out, and did it go to the thing that you said it was going to, and what happened after the fact? Are y'all talking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's could be more important. But just on the visibility, you can't have accountability without visibility. So that's a bedrock kind of concept here. But in terms of like how do you really measure? The question you're asking is, how do you measure performance? That's what the average taxpayer, they're thinking. Okay, people don't think of their lives in economic terms like opportunity cost, but that's really how we make decisions and live our lives. And Milton Friedman, of course, had the famous Friedman box, where the 4 quadrants, and the top left is you spend your own money on yourself. That's the most efficient. The least efficient is spending someone else's money on someone else. Okay, and then the other 2 are you spending your money on someone else and someone else on
right.
So gifts and expenses. But government is always in the bottom right quadrant, and how we live our lives is in the top. So people understand this intuitively. And it's the question of how do you get bang for the buck? Well, how do you measure bang for the buck? Okay, and that's where AI and technology is so critically important, because we have the tools now, and we're building the technologies. And when I say we, I mean just the tech sector. But open the books, we have the biggest database of government spending in human history. So in the interim years, when I left Coburn and worked at Open the Books, I did have my own consulting shop, did PR consulting, worked with a lot of Silicon Valley companies, and learned with people building the technologies is that it's really 3 things that build an AI tool, right? It's big data, it's an algorithm, and it's processing power. So data in that universe is like enriched uranium, okay? It can be used for peaceful purposes or destructive. And when you have the right kind of data, it can be very, very powerful and really nourish and encourage human flourishing and freedom. And the way that works is you take our data set and then you merge it with other data sets that measure economic performance. You look at correlations. So a good example we did this year is we looked at 12,500 school districts. We have about 85-90% coverage with our data. That's a lot of school districts. And we looked at a simple correlation of of a student achievement, the NAEP scores, and found a slight negative correlation between overhead expense and student achievement. Okay, that's just one little example. And then you take all that data though, and you teach and you use an algorithm, just like they did with ChatGPT. And the better example is AlphaFold. I won't take the time to explain it, but it's in chemistry they looked at protein folding. So we can have AlphaFold for public policy, merge these data sets, teach an algorithm to help do pattern recognition and then pattern prediction, and then we can run circles around anything that we think of as an audit today or performance audit. The technology exists to build those tools that will give us far greater insights. It's like transitioning from the whale oil in the Senate chamber, that we would give tours on, to LED lights. I mean, it's mind blowing what we can, and we're really that's part of what I'm doing in Austin is talking to people about these technologies and how do we build them and how do we.
And that seems to be a good, the lane there is, well, if there's a ton of waste, let's use AI to red flag it so that we know we're wasting our money or not getting our bang for the buck on that. But the thing that's happening in Minnesota is not just bang for the buck; it's like fraud. They're just lying. Right. And so can AI? I don't want to talk to you about fraud prevention, but can AI evaluate these data sets to red flag things that might actually be fraud and not
yes,
just waste?
Absolutely. Yeah. It can red flag it, but what it can also do is show. It can illustrate patterns, and the whole vision that I'm describing, AI in the future of freedom, is how we describe our initiative, is that people are right to be very, very concerned about what AI could do to the economy. They're right to be concerned about a surveillance state. But the best way to thwart a surveillance state is to create a surveillance citizenry and give every taxpayer these incredibly powerful tools to hold government accountable. So it's not about individuals delegating their power to some mysterious technology. It's about how do we create a technology that empowers and creates kind of super intelligent citizens. That's what is in reach of building, and that's what we're trying to do. So you give so like in Minnesota, one is sort of having and this takes years to really build the constituency for people to trust a technology like that and to prove that this model is more effective than CBO or other scoring models. But then there's a lot that we should do in the immediate, which again is like don't have stupid rules that encourage payments based on enrollment.
That's just sort of flipping it on. It's like, you're not watching me, I'm watching you.
Exactly. Yeah. It's turning the tables on surveillance.
A surveillance citizenry. And that's really what, citizen journalism is all about, is, opening the books and finding out what government. So I want to get into, because we could, I feel like we're already running out of time. I want to talk about so many things. But I want to get to the heart of this question, which is, it's all well and good once the money's out the door to say that it was spent poorly or that it was stolen or whatever. But how do we figure out a way so that the money doesn't go out the door at all for these? And, Governor Abbott has made an announcement. He sees he's reading the tea leaves and he thinks, if we don't have our systems in place, there could be massive fraud going on here in Texas. And so he's getting out in front of it. But he's talking about things like, income verification, eligibility checks, things like that, to make sure that our systems are in place that have this, protective system on the front end to make sure that, that people who don't have children can't, open up a daycare or, those kinds of things. Or, like the Feeding Our Future. I mean, they were saying that there were 18,000 meals a day, things like that. Like if they're like, how do we catch those guys before the money starts going out the door?
Yeah, I think the number one is to reduce. I mean, it's hard to avoid the big really because the big answer is reducing the size and scope of government. And it's because it's empowering and really investing authority in the primary decision maker. Is that who is driving the bus? You want parents to be driving the bus. You want individual taxpayers. But the system we have now is we give tax money to the state government, the federal government, and then some of it gets sent back in block grants. That's better than just having it directed to enrollment numbers, for example. But all of these are imperfect systems. So we need to really dramatically reduce the size and scope of government. We've got 400 agencies and sub-agencies when the Constitution only describes 4, maybe 5 if you include the Department of Interstate Commerce. So that really is the answer, is shrinking the size and scope of government. You'll have a lot less fraud. But then on that particular one is, I think income verification is a no-brainer. Making sure that investing the authority, this decision-making authority, with parents, is that let parents make the decision. Because again, that gets back to the Friedman box. Okay, instead of moving it in quadrant 4, you're going to move it to quadrant 3, for instance. It's going to be less inefficient. Okay, it's going to be more efficient.
So you empower the consumers to then go and find the daycare that they want, rather than just giving money to somebody calling themselves a daycare.
Which is very similar to what we always would talk about with healthcare. Turn and consumers, equip consumers with buying power is really is one of the big reform concepts.
We're starting to see more of these scams come out in the medical field and in various other industries. Does that kind of model? It makes sense, in the daycare sense, or in the daycare context, but does that model work across other industries like healthcare and energy or wherever there might be scamming?
Yeah, and it's important to keep in mind. So the healthcare sector is $4.9 trillion. Okay, that's a huge, massive amount of it. It's bigger than most economies in the world. And we waste between 25 and 33%. There's been lots of studies done on this. Pete Peterson Foundation a few years ago said 25% of all healthcare money is wasted. Okay, so we're talking. So as shocking as the Minnesota example is, there is far more fraud happening right now in the healthcare sector because of all the perverse incentives, because we've separated the purchaser and the actual healthcare. There's all these middlemen in the healthcare system. So my hope with what we're seeing in Minnesota is this is one of these galvanizing moments where it's so shocking and so absurd and ridiculous that the Leering Center, they took the end out of learning. And so when these examples are very useful because it's like the bridge to nowhere back in the earmark days, where it's an outrageous example that is illustrative of a systemic problem. And that's kind of the hope, is that Minnesota creates momentum among the electorate to say this is completely out of control. I want to get my arms wrapped around this, and let's tackle it.
So a question that I have with that, and I think that's a really good way of flagging it, and I want to stick on the topic of healthcare for a minute.
Okay.
So you mentioned the perverse incentives. By the way they'd quantify it, whether it's 25, 33%, what have you, by the way they quantify it is the structural inefficiency, I would say, particularly with the middlemen that you're pointing out. Is that part of the 33%, or is that part of the 67%? I mean, my question not being that I think it's a measurement issue here, but I'm saying we started off with that saying that it was a feature or a bug.
Yeah.
And I think that's the issue, especially with healthcare, is we have a system where the feature is the graft, the siphoning. You mentioned that we, obviously keeping the dollars closer to the consumer of the product. Completely agree with that. What other reforms in the healthcare space specifically, because you obviously thought about this quite a bit, should states be looking at in order to rein in healthcare costs? Because obviously it's a very, very potent cost driver right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, price transparency, right? So transparency we've talked about transparency with federal dollars, right? And it's important. Just a quick side note is this issue gets conflated so often, particularly on the progressive left, is transparency is not a two-way street. We have the right to inspect the government's checkbook because it's our money. They do not have the right to inspect our checkbook. So a lot of campaign finance proposals are really intrusive, empowering the authoritarian state against the individual. That's not transparency. But in healthcare, it's really people talk about market failure, right? This idea of, the market isn't working. Well, we've never really allowed the market to work in healthcare. We've had a Frankenstein system really since World War II, where there was I'm sure you guys have looked at the origins of the tax treatment of healthcare, of creating this sort of bank shot economy. And that really opened the door to all the middlemen. So you're right. Healthcare in particular illustrates this concept that it's a feature, it's not a bug. It's really designed to be inefficient. And in spite of that, of course, we have the world's best healthcare. We have tons of innovation, but we'd have a lot more innovation, and we'd be able to avoid our crushing national debt, because it's related to healthcare entitlement programs. $38 trillion. We're spending more on interest payments than we are on defense. Nations that do that don't stay great for very long. No. So I think price transparency at every state, and then states need to be allowed to innovate and do things at the state level and let states be the laboratories of democracy, but also entrepreneurship, and let states compete. And rather than have, again, why should we have one size fits all behemoth federal agencies when maybe states or regions should get together and think, hey, let's make sure that we don't have people fall through the cracks. But what we see is this counterfeit compassion dynamic at work, where
that term.
If we only spend more money helping, quote, poor people with health care, well, obviously that doesn't work. Medicaid is set up to be a money laundering system at the state level. So there's a lot that I think governors really can lead the way here in creating these models and forcing change that then could be replicated and duplicated in other places.
And of course, Obamacare created what we call the unholy alliance between the federal government, the hospitals, and the insurers, where there's no incentive to keep costs down because hospitals charge whatever they want, insurance companies pay it, and they pass the costs on to the consumer, and then the government swoops in and subsidizes everything, hence our $38 trillion. And it just is a cycle that
that was after Medicare, Medicaid existed. So that made it worse.
Exactly. Where do you see the worst fraud? Do you see it at the federal level, to the extent that you can see it, or do you see it in the states where California's and New York's of the world where they have such bad actors?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, it's often worse at the state level, because at the federal level, again, there's so much commingling of funds, it's hard to fully separate it out. But often what you see is there's a huge variety of actors, good and bad actors at the state level. And I think at the federal level, in some ways it's harder to hide and it's harder to game the system because there are fewer layers. So, but you get to the state level, you have different rooms you can hide in. Okay, you have the flow of block grants, federal to state. You have state dollars. There's a lot of commingling and confusion, and that's where fraudsters really take advantage of it. So in California is a good example where there's state money being used, state taxpayer money to actually promote, not just be neutral with immigration, but actually promote and create magnets for illegal immigration. And that sort of raises issues of is this a neo-Confederate state? What are they doing? And New York, very similar situation too.
What's the worst? I mean, Minnesota is probably now the worst case of fraud in the country's history. But prior to this, did you have a favorite instance of when you give speeches, one that you point out?
Sure. Well, I mean, the earmarks that's pretty been well talked about. But the other one that is just so funny and absurd is Social Security disability fraud. So we did a major investigation. 60 Minutes actually did a great segment on this, and it became a documentary on Apple TV called The Big Con. This guy, Eric Conn, C-O-N-N, great name.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing we've been talking about, is he exploited the feature in the system, the feature, not a bug, to milk the Social Security disability system. So he was an attorney. He would get people to sign up, pay him a bunch of money. He would game the system and get fake doctor claims to declare disability, and he would just rake it in. He was making millions and millions of dollars off of this scheme, and had billboards, up all over promoting his bad work. But one of the cases that was so timeless is there was a guy named Stanley Thornton, and he. Back before we would talk about self-identifying, he would self-identify as an adult baby. So he would literally role play as an adult baby, and he got Social Security disability. And here was this grown man in his 40s who was capable of carpentry. He built his own crib, but he was disabled.
That is
and he got Social Security
bizarre.
disability. So that is the case that... did this actually happen in the real? It's it really happened. The adult baby, bizarre. Stanley Thornton.
Well, and then the question is, it sounds like these people only get caught because they're so brazen, they're so out in the open. What is it? Pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered, kind of thing. And that's the only reason we even know about these. If these guys just wouldn't, put the billboards up and do these weird things like identify as babies, they could be millionaires for the rest of their life, just feeding off the government trough. Is it? I mean, and that's kind of what I'm getting to is was like, if it weren't for them being so greedy and so brazen, we wouldn't even know about this stuff. Where are the controls and the checks for everybody else that's actually cheating and not being, not being so brazen about it?
Right. For every adult baby, there's 100 people who aren't adult babies that shouldn't be.
Can we clip that quote?
Yeah. That's so insane. And so, is there anybody working on this? I want to get to earmarks, by the way, because that's a fun. I mean, you and I go way back on the earmark stuff, and it's just the culture of earmarks is just so different than it was in the late aughts.
Right.
But is there anybody working on this? Is there any federal legislation that's trying to put these controls into place so that we stop sending the checks, so that we increase the amount of checks and validation and all verification? Sure. Is there anybody working on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are working on it. I mean, I met with Russ Vought. I met with Russ last week. Talked about this. OMB is all over this.
Great.
I know that Tim. I don't want to put Tim Burchett on the spot, but he's the new DOGE chair. I'm going to go in and talk to him about this. So there's not a deficit of people wanting to do the right thing and wanting to really get their arms wrapped around it. It's and again, there's in life there are rarely the silver bullet answer. It's really in all of the above. It's we got to have better transparency laws, but while we pursue that, we got to identify the immediate hemorrhaging of taxpayer money through fraud and fix those things. And
fix the leak.
Yeah, right. The administration's doing that too. So yeah, it's both fixing the leak and fixing the plumbing.
Yeah,
is really the.
I want to talk about earmarks. You wrote a recent piece on your Substack about that, so I want to get into earmarks just because it's this was people don't understand the culture of this back in even before 2011. In 2011 there was a moratorium by my old boss, Senator Lee. It was the very first thing he ever worked on. He actually worked on it before he even took the oath of office and went into Mitch McConnell's office, and there's the whole article that was written about what he did there, and ended earmarks for a better part of a decade. But prior to that, these spending bills would come out, and you would just get these laundry lists of all of these these individual items, $10,000 here, $100,000 there, and it was a lot of fun because during the budget battle, guys like at the time Representative Coburn and Representative Jeff Flake and others would go down to the floor, and they would have amendments on every single one of these and force the entire or at least the entire House to vote for or against the lobster museum in Maine or there was a teacup museum in New Hampshire or something like that. All
the Woodstock Museum in New York.
The Woodstock, all these museums, that were getting all this federal
parking
funding.
garages that Patty Murray wanted.
And so you would have literally every single member of Congress would have a vote up or down for or against these crazy things, and then of course the political arms would then take those votes and they would go out and they would say, Representative Smith voted for the Teacup Museum or voted for
Big Teacup strikes again.
Yeah, Big Teacup. So it was a lot of fun, back in the day you could do that. But then of course the moratorium came in. I didn't realize this. The moratorium ended in 2011, and we're back doing earmarks.
Yeah.
And
2021.
Sorry, 2021.
It held for about a decade.
Yeah, and it held for it was just precedent, right? So somebody had to actually. It wasn't like the law ran out. Yeah. They just said, okay, we're done with this. We're going to put earmarks back in. Did they blame COVID or what happened?
Well, I think I think the issue decreased in salience, right? And that's the challenge of politics is how do you make these issues front burner? That's part of why the Minnesota thing is so important. Is that this feels like the early Tea Party era, okay? And that's why I'm so glad you're focusing on this. So on earmarks, it's it's important to ask, well, why did we have earmarks? How long have we had earmarks? So back when I was with Coburn in the House, we actually started to go after individual earmarks back in the late 90s, in 1998. And it took 12 years, by the way, to get to a moratorium that held for it. So it sort of illustrates how change can happen if you're persistent, but it can take a long time.
Yeah.
And so never give up, but don't be discouraged if DOGE doesn't immediately result in changing the fiscal world.
And so are we back in your report? By the way, I want to give you I want to let you take a victory lap. How much did we save with the moratorium?
About $140 billion.
That's amazing.
So that's the delta between what would have been spent and what was spent because of the moratorium.
And so are we back in the old days, or
well,
what's going on?
It's not quite as bad as the old days, but again, in the height of the heyday of the earmark favor factory, as we called it back in 2006, I think it was, we had 16,000 earmarks per year. And a few years before that, in the 1980s, President Reagan famously quipped that I've never seen, and it was a transportation bill. I think there were 141 earmarks. I'd have to go back and look at the book I wrote 20 years ago on this. But he said, I've never seen that much pork since the Iowa State Fair. And that was like a few dozen or 100 or so. And then it went to 16,000. Because the argument that the appropriators would make is, well, earmarks have always been a part of the process. They're written into the system, and that's just fundamentally not true. Is that, yes, politics have always been a part of politics, but we never had the graft and that culture of individual members having what Flake called walking around money. We called it.
I remember that.
We called it, walking around money. Earmarksism was another one I think Eric Erickson came up with. Ours was earmarks are the gateway drug to Washington's spending addiction. And the earmark process really it gets to the fundamental issue we talked about of the administrative state and the creation of that over 100 years ago. And earmarks were designed by members who felt frustrated that the quote agencies were making all the decisions. Oh, the bureaucrats are making all the decisions. We can't delegate all this power to bureaucrats, so we need to take some of it back. Well, Congress, you're the ones that created and allowed this to continue. So you're not helpless victims here. And that the biggest problem in D.C. is not executive overreach, it's congressional underreach. It's members not using their, and Lee is phenomenal on that theme. Congress needs to use its muscle and take that power back from agencies, because the earmark system is kind of like treating a heroin addiction with a cocaine addiction. And you're not going to get more efficiency. And the answer is to shrink what we expect the federal government to do, not to correct it through earmarks. And so they're not as bad as they used to be, but they're still a big problem. And the effective member is not the one who sends money back to the district. The effective member is the one who never lets money leave the district in the first place. So instead of growing federal agencies, we want to build your agency. And your ability to pursue happiness on your terms. That's what the dream should be.
Oh, I love that metaphor. You have rats in the house, so better bring in some snakes to take care of the rats. And then you got to bring in gorillas to take care of the snakes or whatever. But I think one of the issues here and the problem of a supine Congress is not one that is wasted on Brian or how we talk about it quite frequently. The problem, of course, being that we send unvirtuous, increasingly unserious people to represent us in Congress year after year. I think, and obviously, hope not being a strategy, that there needs to be a reclaiming civically of the virtues of public service. But that's a whole other pod for another time. Sure. Question I want to ask. So you've obviously seen a lot of model, I would say, policies and legislation, administrative rules in this case. What state is doing it the best overall?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, Texas.
All right.
That is the correct answer, even though it's not true.
Feel free to blow smoke. It's fine. We'll take it.
I think I'd give. I think Youngkin right now is really making maximum effort.
Helps that you're lame duck when you get elected.
Kevin Stead in Oklahoma, great governor. So there. I think Texas, Oklahoma, Virginia, I think are doing the right thing.
And just in terms of transparency and what what our systems are allowed, and we're working on it. I mean, it's going to be part of our LAA. We still don't think that we're there. I mean, there's still we're in court. We're fighting over things like redacted memorandums of work and all that kind of stuff. So we still have a lot to go to get there in Texas. We think.
And I would say just another on the issue of like FOIAs and getting what's the term in Texas again?
PIA, public information.
Right, PIAs, So those all vary state to state, but it is really, if you back up and think, that's really absurd that you have to effectively force taxpayers to get a search warrant to find out how government's spending their own money. Like that is outrageous, and we need to make sure we elevate that outrage because it's ridiculous. So in Colorado, we just did a FOIA request for a public school district, and the bill is $40,000.
Yeah.
So in other words, they want us to take the donors, the supporters of our organization, and use their money to do their work for them. And that needs to change.
Yeah, we've got some laws like that. We have had that problem, and the legislature has been trying to address some of that stuff. So you can't charge more than $1 a page or something like that, whatever it is. So we're working on all those issues and they seem to be using all the same tactics too. I mean, in many cases, we're having to appeal to the Attorney General just to get them to answer us. You know, they do the rigmarole, or they say, you didn't ask the right question, so I can't answer you. And they don't tell you what question you're supposed to ask. Of course, you're supposed to
they don't want to help
some kind of Da Vinci code to figure out how to get there.
The real PIA request is on the back of the declaration. So
that's right. We got the treasure hunt. All right. So while we have a couple more minutes, you did bring up Nick Shirley, and I know you're an old comms guy. So very interesting that you always thought that yes, there was a left right dynamic with the press, and there was conservative press and left wing press, but everybody if you had a story on corruption, it didn't matter. I mean, that was, that you could make or break your career if you had some kind of corruption story about fraud or about, a lack of accountability and those kinds of things. And yet, in today's world, the press is, the big networks are not interested at all in this massive story that's happening in Minnesota.
Everybody attacked the journalists.
Yeah, they attacked the journalists.
Right,
CNN everybody, the fact that the New York Times wrote their article, everybody's head exploded because we were couldn't believe this. So I'm interested, from putting on your old comms hat, kind of where we are in the world with this, where you have, anybody can pick up a camera. Nick Shirley can become an overnight, although he wasn't technically an overnight sensation, so I don't want to do that to him. But he can become an overnight sensation because he can pick up a phone and a camera, and his mom can go, can go do the thing that that why didn't CNN do this?
Why didn't 60 Minutes have the guy in the bush jump out?
Exactly. So I'm curious about, because you deal in that world all the time, do you get frustrated that the major outlets, it takes so long for them to cover something like this? Or do you see it as a real opportunity because now you can find the next Nick Shirley of the world and say, hey, we've got a story for you?
No, I think it's very, very exciting. And look, and not to pick on 60 Minutes too much, because again, we did some great work with 60 Minutes in the Coburn years on the Social Security disability. So the mainstream media, they really they're capable, but it's embarrassing when you have a Nick Shirley go do a phenomenal piece of journalism. And the quote, the fact checks are so strange because they're all ad hominem attacks on him. It's like, well, I don't care what you think about his personality or his politics. Yeah. What does the data tell you?
Right.
And so the way I think of the world is really, it isn't so much, yes, there's a conservative progressive bias, but there's also kind of the analog world versus the digital world. And we're roughly the same age, but I was on the Hill a few years before you were. And we lived through the dawn and that transition of the analog to the digital, where when we started to go after earmarks, we had what we call the blogosphere back before there was social media. Guys like Rob Bluey, who's now at the Daily Signal, NZ Bear, who was Porkbusters. And we realized, hey, there's a whole nother flow of information that we can tap into to reach the audience. And we did that very, very effectively. And of course, that's now exploded since then.
And now it's video, so
it's
more real.
This is one of the most, I'm convinced that when historians look at this era, the big date isn't going to be 9/11. It's going to be when the internet came online, because that's as significant as when the printing press was invented over 600 years ago. And what happened when the printing press came on is it disrupted all the established institutions of power and authority, the literal monasteries, right? Because they were concerned that, what's going to happen when individuals can read and interpret scripture on their own. And that was extremely disruptive. It led to wars and reformations, but then a renaissance. And we're living through the same scope of change right now. And it's kind of like, it's hard to analyze a storm in the middle of the hurricane. We're trying to understand what's happening. And we're living through a complete transformation of how information flows. So some of the flagships and institutions will survive and they'll adapt and adjust. But you're going to continue to see examples of Nick Shirley, just entrepreneurs, citizen journalists. And that's why what we're doing with transparency is so powerful, because we just published a database of all these daycares, and again, it varies state to state, but anyone, it's kind of a call to arms and to crowdsource oversight and to say, hey, take responsibility. Here's the data. Go get a camera, go walk to the center and find out if anyone's there. And empower the citizen journalists to do that. And the more that becomes part of our political culture, the less fraudsters will feel an incentive or feel this, or operate with a sense of impunity that they can go do whatever they want to do.
You know, Derek, it's not like us to end on a positive note, but that is a great, hopefully inspires people to pick up that camera and if you hear about this stuff in your community, to go and do something about it, because, like you said, I think the thing that's embarrassing about the press is not just that they didn't cover it, but that they, most of the time, they had the opportunity and didn't take it. And you see that happen a lot. So anyway, John, it was great to see you. Great to have you come in here. Hopefully we'll continue to form a partnership. And as we move forward, it sounds like Greg Abbott is very serious about combing through the books, and maybe you guys can come down and be a part of that. We'd love to partner with you on pulling out that data and using all your AI tools to help protect taxpayers.
Okay, I'm on board.
Awesome.
Okay,
all right,
appreciate you guys.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And as we always like to say at the end of our podcast, in the immortal words of Sam Houston, do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.